The Intergalactic Federation has a penal code spanning 3 million pages. It dictates the laws of physics, interstellar trade, and warfare. But on page 1, printed in bold, universally translated text, sits a single absolute law. Never, ever corner a wounded human. Here's the classified reason why. In the standard Earth year, 2142, the expansion of humanity was spearheaded not by military armadas, but by corporate titans. The Lockheed Boeing Exo Mining Corporation had established Outpost Delta Niner on a desolate, jagged rock designated LV-426b, nestled in the resource-rich rings of the Epsilon Eridani system. It was a bleak, unforgiving place. The atmosphere was a toxic soup of methane and ammonia, and the surface temperature could flash freeze a lung in 3 seconds. Sergeant Thomas Hendricks was a career security contractor for Lockheed Boeing. He was 38, possessed a face lined with the stress of a dozen deep space deployments, and commanded a small security detail tasked with protecting the helium. 3 extraction rigs. His squad consisted of Corporal James Miller, a communications specialist from Chicago, and Specialist Evelyn Cross, a combat medic who had cut her teeth in the orbital skirmishes around Mars. They were not soldiers fighting a galactic war. They were simply corporate guards meant to deter pirates. They were entirely unprepared for the Kalanon ascendancy. The Kalanons were a terrifying apex predator species, standing 7 feet tall, clad in naturally evolved chitinous plating, and driven by a deeply ingrained cultural mandate of the honorable hunt. They viewed the galaxy as their personal hunting ground. They possessed energy weapons that fired concentrated bolts of superheated plasma, and their tactical doctrine was built on overwhelming speed and predatory aggression. To the Kalanons, humans were classified as class, 3 soft tissues. Biologically speaking, humanity appeared pathetic to the wider galaxy. We lack natural armor. We have poor night vision. Our hearing is subpar, and our skin can be pierced by a stiff breeze. The Kalanon fleet commander, a veteran named Vral, viewed the raid on Outpost Delta Niner as a training exercise for his younger warriors. The assault began without warning. A Kalanon dreadnought dropped out of slipspace, instantly crippling the Lockheed Boeing orbital communications buoy. Within minutes, drop pods slammed into the regolith outside the refinery. Hendricks was in the mess hall drinking a cup of synthetic coffee when the primary blast doors blew inward, a concussive wave of heat and shrapnel tearing through the room. The Kalanon warriors poured in, their plasma rifles turning the automated defense turrets to molten slag in seconds. "Contact! Heavy armor! Unknown hostiles!" Hendricks roared, flipping a heavy steel table to serve as makeshift cover. "Miller, get on the horn! Cross, prep the trauma kits!" They fought a fighting retreat down the metallic corridors of the refinery. Hendricks fired his standard-issue General Dynamics pulse rifle, but the rounds sparked and deflected off the Kalanon's heavy armor. They were pushed deeper into the facility, driven down into the labyrinthine network of coolant pipes and ventilation shafts in Sector 4, a dead end. Then, it happened. As Hendricks laid down, suppressing fire to let Miller and Cross slip through a heavy blast door, a Kalanon vanguard flanked him. The alien fired a burst of plasma. Hendricks tried to pivot, but the superheated bolt caught him in the lower right abdomen. The kinetic force threw him backward against the bulkhead. The heat of the plasma instantly vaporized his Kevlar weave armor, searing through muscle, flesh, and grazing his liver. The smell of his own burning meat filled his helmet. It was a catastrophic, fatal wound. In the Intergalactic Federation's medical database, a wound of that magnitude induces immediate, irreversible neurogenic shock in 98% of known sentient species. The pain receptors overload the brain, causing instantaneous unconsciousness followed by rapid circulatory collapse. Commander Vral, watching the feed from his command ship, clicked his mandibles in satisfaction. The prey was broken. He keyed his comms, speaking through a crude translation matrix patched into the station's PA system. "Human defenders, your leader is mortally wounded. His biological functions will cease in less than 3 of your minutes. You are cornered in Sector 4. Surrender, and your deaths will be swift. Resist, and you will be studied." Inside the dimly lit coolant room, Cross dragged Hendricks behind a massive intake valve. Her hands were shaking as she ripped open her medical kit. "Tommy, stay with me. Oh God, Tommy, look at me." Hendricks coughed, spitting a glob of blood onto the grated floor. His face was pale, slick with cold sweat. He looked down at the charred, smoking crater in his side. According to the Kalanon tactical AI, Thomas Hendricks was already a corpse. But the aliens didn't understand human biology. They didn't understand the dark, evolutionary magic of the human endocrine system. In the deep recesses of Hendricks's brain, a primitive switch was flipped. It was a switch forged millions of years ago on the savannas of Earth, designed for the exact moment when a primate was trapped in a cave with a saber-toothed tiger. As the agonizing pain signals rushed up his spinal cord, his hypothalamus screamed. His adrenal glands, sitting atop his kidneys, flooded his bloodstream with massive, toxic doses of epinephrine and norepinephrine. His heart rate spiked to 180 beats per minute. His bronchioles dilated, pulling in massive amounts of oxygen. The blood vessels in his digestive tract and extremities constricted, forcing all available blood to his heart, lungs, and brain. Endorphins, nature's painkillers. Chemically similar to morphine, but exponentially more potent, washed over his nervous system, effectively severing the connection between his brain and the searing agony in his abdomen. Cross, Hendricks rasped, his voice strangely calm. His pupils dilated so wide his eyes looked entirely black. I need you to seal it. Tommy, I don't have the tools. The internal bleeding is... Seal it! He barked, his voice carrying a terrifying, guttural edge. Use the emergency flare. Cauterize it. Cross stared at him in horror. A standard issue phosphorus flare burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But she saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a dying man. It was the look of a cornered predator. With trembling hands, she cracked the emergency flare. The brilliant red light threw harsh shadows against the pipes. Hendricks grabbed a metal wrench, biting down on the steel handle. Do it, he grunted through his teeth. Cross jammed the burning flare directly into the plasma wound. The sound Hendricks made was something not quite human. It was a roar that vibrated through the steel floorboards, a primal scream of raw, unadulterated fury that echoed into the ventilation shafts. The stench of burning flesh intensified, but the makeshift cauterization worked. The agonizing heat fused the blood vessels shut, temporarily halting the massive hemorrhaging. Hendricks spat out the wrench. He was panting heavily, sweat pouring down his face, but he stood up. He picked up his pulse rifle. Miller, Cross, listen to me very carefully, Hendricks said, checking his ammunition counter. There's a maintenance hatch behind this coolant tank. It leads to a sub-basement 3 levels down. It's shielded from thermal scans. You go there. You wait for the emergency corporate extraction. We are not leaving you, Sergeant, Miller protested, gripping his own sidearm. That's an order, James, Hendricks snapped. I am a dead man walking. My liver is cooked, and my blood is half adrenaline and dirt. But I am not dying in this room. He looked up at the PA speaker mounted on the ceiling. The Kalanon commander had cornered them. Vral believed he had trapped a dying animal. They want to hunt, Hendricks whispered, a terrifying, bloody smile stretching across his face. Let's show them how humans hunt. As Miller and Cross reluctantly slipped into the maintenance hatch, Hendricks began to move. He didn't try to hide. Instead, he ripped a heavy, high-voltage power cable from a nearby junction box, exposing the live, sparking wires. Outside the heavy blast doors of Sector 4, a squad of 6 elite Kalanon warriors stacked up. They were expecting to find 2 cowering survivors and a corpse. Their thermal optics showed only the ambient heat of the coolant machinery. The heavy door hissed open. The warriors stepped in, their heavy, clawed feet clanking against the metal gratings. From the shadows above the doorway, clinging to the overhead pipes with arms fueled by hysterical, adrenaline-induced strength, Hendricks dropped. He didn't fire his rifle. He slammed the exposed, high-voltage power cable directly into the gap between the lead Kalanon's neck plating. 2,000 volts of raw, unshielded, alternating current surged through the alien's nervous system. The massive creature seized violently, its internal organs instantly boiling, and collapsed in a smoking heap. Before the other 5 could react, Hendricks pulled the pin on a flashbang grenade, dropped it at their feet, and threw himself over the railing into the lower coolant trench. The grenade detonated, blinding the Kalanons. In the confusion, Hendricks accessed the manual override wheel for the primary liquid helium coolant pipe. With a roar of exertion, he snapped the safety lock and ripped the valve open. A pressurized jet of liquid helium, sitting at minus 452 degrees Fahrenheit, blasted into the corridor. The blindly firing Kalenons were caught in the stream. Their chitinous armor, designed to withstand intense heat and kinetic impact, instantly froze and became as brittle as cheap glass. The sudden, extreme drop in temperature sent the cold-blooded aliens into instant, fatal shock. In less than 40 seconds, the elite Vanguard squad was entirely wiped out. Back on the Dreadnought, Commander Vral stared at his tactical monitors in utter disbelief. 6 of his best warriors' biosignatures flatlined. And the thermal signature of the human, the one with the catastrophic fatal organ failure, was not only active, it was moving. It was moving fast, and it was moving toward them. The Kalenon medical officer, a senior scientist named Tarax, frantically analyzed the telemetry. "Commander," Tarax stammered, his mandibles clicking nervously. "The human, its heart rate is critical. Its blood pressure is catastrophic. By all biological logic, its brain should have shut down from trauma shock. But instead, its system is flooding with a cocktail of neurochemicals. It is overriding its own death sequence." "Impossible," Vral hissed. "No prey acts like this. When wounded, the instinct is to hide, to conserve energy, to wait for death." "Not humans, sir," Tarax replied, his voice tinged with a sudden, creeping dread. "When you corner them, when you take away their hope of survival, they stop fighting to live. They fight to ensure you die with them." Hendricks was a ghost in the machine of the refinery. His body was failing. The crude cauterization was holding, but the internal trauma was slowly poisoning him. His vision was blurring at the edges, a creeping dark vignette that he forced away with sheer, obstinate rage. Every step was a negotiation with agony. But the adrenaline made him hyper-focused. He felt a cold, crystalline clarity. He was bleeding out, intentionally leaving drops of blood on the gratings. It was a trail, a bait. Vral, deeply insulted by the loss of his vanguard, sent 2 full platoons, 40 warriors, into the facility to hunt down the single dying human. They followed the blood trail, their thermal optics tracking the faint heat signature. Hendricks led them away from the sub-basement where Miller and Cross were hiding. He led them upward, into the heavy machinery bay, where the raw, unrefined Epsilon Eridani ore was crushed. The Kalenons moved with military precision, sweeping the massive, cavernous room. The machinery was silent, powered down during the attack. They spotted Hendrix's bloody handprints on the control console of a massive, 3-story-tall industrial rock crusher. 2 Kalenons approached the console, weapons raised. High above them, perched precariously on a structural crossbeam, Hendricks watched. He had rigged a simple remote trigger using the comms unit from his helmet and the control wires of the heavy machinery. As the bulk of the Kalenon platoon filed into the kill zone beneath the massive steel jaws of the crushing pistons, Hendricks pressed the transmit button on his wrist pad. The machinery bay roared to life. The automated safety protocols had been bypassed. The massive steel pistons, each weighing 50 tons, slammed downward with devastating force. The sound of crushing, chitin, and alien shrieks was deafening. The floor shook violently. Hendricks didn't stay to watch the carnage. He knew Vral would pinpoint his location now. He slid down a ventilation shaft, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. He had perhaps 20 minutes of consciousness left. He needed to make it count. Vral was no longer clicking his mandibles in amusement. He was enraged, but beneath that rage was a cold, unfamiliar spike of terror. This soft tissue had turned an industrial refinery into a slaughterhouse. "Seal the blast doors. Vent the oxygen in the upper levels," Vral ordered from his command throne. "Starve the creature. It is bleeding. It is broken. It cannot survive without atmosphere." Hendricks felt the air pressure drop as he stumbled through the administrative corridors. The emergency bulkhead slammed shut, locking down the sectors. The oxygen scrubbers reversed, sucking the breathable air out of the station. Hendricks collapsed against a wall, clutching his side. He pulled an emergency oxygen mask from a wall-mounted safety station and strapped it over his face, breathing deeply of the canned air. He looked at a digital schematic of the station on the wall. Vral thought Hendricks was trying to survive. Vral thought Hendricks was trying to find a way out, or a way to call for help. Hendricks wasn't trying to do either. He was looking at the schematic of the station's orbital tether. The refinery was anchored to the asteroid by a massive, localized gravity generator, a masterwork of engineering developed by Bauer Synthetics. It kept the facility from floating off into the void of the Epsilon Eridani rings. The Kalanon dreadnought was currently locked into a low-orbit geostationary hold, hovering directly above the facility, tethered to the station's docking umbilicus to siphon its fuel reserves. Hendricks smiled beneath his oxygen mask. It was a ghastly expression. He dragged himself into the central maintenance hub. He didn't shoot his way in. He used a cutting torch to bypass the electronic locks. He locked himself inside the gravity anchor's primary control room. It took the Kalanons 10 minutes to cut through the reinforced steel doors of the control room. When they finally breached it, Commander Vral himself stepped through the sparking threshold, flanked by his heaviest shock troops. They found Sergeant Thomas Hendricks sitting in the main operator's chair. He was covered in blood, pale as a ghost, his breathing shallow and erratic. His pulse rifle was tossed carelessly on the floor. He didn't even look up as the Kalanons trained 20 plasma rifles on him. "It is over, human," Vral declared, stepping forward, his massive frame towering over the dying man. "You have fought with an honor I did not anticipate from your frail species, but you are cornered. You have nowhere left to run. Your body is failing. Surrender to your death." Hendricks slowly lifted his head. His eyes met the alien commander's. There was no fear in them. There was only a cold, abyssal emptiness. "I'm not running, you overgrown lizard," Hendricks whispered, his voice weak but perfectly carried through the room's acoustics. "And I'm already dead. I died an hour ago down in Sector 4. Vral frowned, his mandibles twitching. "Then what is your purpose? Why prolong your suffering?" Hendricks tapped the central console with a blood-stained finger. A massive holographic schematic of the station and the dreadnought above it materialized in the center of the room. "You cornered me," Hendricks wheezed, a bloody cough racking his frame. "First rule of human warfare, Commander. You never corner something unless you're prepared to kill it instantly. Because when you back us into a corner, when you take away our future, our hope, our families..." Hendricks paused, taking a rattling breath. "We stop caring about survival." Vral looked at the holographic display. The gravity anchor's core temperature was flashing a brilliant warning red. The polarity was shifting. "What have you done?" Vral demanded, stepping back. "I didn't hack your comms. I didn't try to call for help," Hendricks said, his hand resting over a manual lever on the console. "I spent the last 20 minutes rewriting the safety protocols of the Bauer gravity anchor. You see, your dreadnought is docked to our umbilicus. If I invert the gravity field of this station, it doesn't just turn off the artificial gravity." The Kalanon tactical officer next to Vral let out a horrified screech. "Commander! The anchor! He's inverting the singularity field! It's going to create a localized gravitational well." Vral lunged forward. "Stop him." Hendricks yanked the lever down. "It's going to rip your billion-ton dreadnought out of orbit and slam it directly into this facility at terminal velocity," Hendricks finished, leaning back in his chair, closing his eyes. "See you in hell, Commander." The silence in the primary control room lasted for exactly 1.5 seconds. It was the calm before a storm of impossible physics. Then, the Bauer gravity anchor registered the manual override. Deep beneath the bedrock of LV-426b, a massive, spinning sphere of super-dense dark matter, the heart of the artificial gravity generator suddenly halted its gyroscopic rotation. Relays screamed. Circuit breakers the size of transport trucks sparked and blew, and the magnetic containment fields violently inverted their polarity. Instead of pushing away the natural centrifugal forces of the asteroid to maintain a stable 1G environment, the anchor became a localized, ravenous singularity. It artificially multiplied the gravitational pull of the immediate 2-square-mile radius by a factor of 50. Above the outpost, tethered by a heavily armored refueling umbilicus, the Kalanon dreadnought Pride of the Ascendancy was a vessel built for orbital superiority. It weighed approximately 1.2 billion metric tons. It was shielded against solar flares, meteor impacts, and heavy plasma bombardment. It was not designed to suddenly weigh 60 billion tons. Inside the control room, the immediate effect was horrifyingly visceral. The ambient air pressure spiked. Commander Vral, standing at an imposing 7 feet of armored muscle, was driven to his knees as if struck by the invisible hand of an angry god. The heavy shock troops behind him collapsed, their reinforced exoskeletons groaning under the sudden, crushing weight of their own bodies. The floor gratings bowed and shrieked. Vral's internal organs were compressed. He gasped for air, his mandibles scraping against the blood-stained steel floor. He looked up, his compound eyes wide with a terror he had never known. Sergeant Thomas Hendricks was still in the operator's chair. Because he was already seated, the gravity spike didn't crush him against the floor, but the G-force was flattening him against the backrest. Blood was freely streaming from his nose, his eyes, and his ears. The crude cauterization in his side had ruptured under the pressure, and a fresh, dark stain was spreading across his torn uniform. Yet, Hendricks was smiling. It was a terrifying, serene smile, a bloody, broken grin of absolute victory. You madman, Vral choked out, his vocal cords struggling against the crushing weight of his own neck. You will destroy everything, yourself included. I told you, Hendricks whispered, his voice barely audible over the deafening mechanical roar of the station tearing itself apart. I died an hour ago. You're just catching up. Above them, the sky was falling. On the bridge of the Pride of the Ascendancy, alarms that had never been triggered in the vessel's 200-year service history began to wail. The primary anti-gravity repulsors, designed to keep the massive ship hovering gracefully in low orbit, were suddenly fighting against the pull of a black hole. Maximum thrust! Reroute all auxiliary power to the lower repulsor thrusters, screamed the Dreadnought's pilot, frantically tearing at his console. It is insufficient, the engineering officer howled. The umbilicus! We are tethered to the colony. The gravitational well is centered directly below us. Hull integrity is failing. The heavy, refueling umbilicus, a cylinder of reinforced titanium and carbon nanotubes, was pulled taut. For a brief, terrifying moment, the Dreadnought's massive engines actually managed to lift the entire crust of LV-426b, ripping a mile-wide chunk of the asteroid's surface upward into the void. But gravity always wins. With a sound like a planetary spine snapping, the Dreadnought's structural keel fractured. The umbilicus didn't break. Instead, it acted like a titanium leash, dragging the nose of the billion-ton warship violently downward. The main thrusters blew out in a spectacular cascade of blue plasma, unable to fight the 50G pull. Down in the control room, the ceiling began to buckle. The sound of the descending Dreadnought pushing through the thin, toxic atmosphere of the asteroid sounded like the roaring of 1,000 freight trains. Vral, using every ounce of his apex predator strength, tried to crawl toward Hendricks. He raised his plasma pistol, his arm trembling violently under the artificial gravity. He wanted to kill the human. He needed to assert his dominance, even in the final seconds of his life. Hendricks didn't flinch. He didn't try to stop the alien. He simply turned his head, looking past Vral, his eyes glazing over as the massive overdose of adrenaline finally began to metabolize, leaving only the cold reality of his fatal wounds. Miller, Hendricks murmured to the empty air, his mind already drifting away from the apocalypse he had summoned. Cross, keep your heads down. Vral pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt left the barrel, but the intense gravitational field warped its trajectory, slamming it harmlessly into the floorboards mere inches from the commander's own hand. Vral stared at the scorch mark, the absolute realization of his impotence crashing over him. He was a fleet commander of the Kalanon Ascendancy, a master of the honorable hunt. And he had been utterly defeated by a dying class, 3 soft tissue who simply refused to lose. The impact was not an explosion. It was a geological event. The nose of the Dreadnought struck the administrative spire of Outpost Delta Niner at roughly 4,000 miles per hour. The kinetic energy released was equivalent to a barrage of tactical nuclear weapons. The administrative spire was instantly vaporized. The Dreadnought's hull accordion crumpled, millions of tons of hardened battle steel compressing, superheating, and shattering. The shockwave ripped outward, obliterating the helium. 3 refineries, shattering the jagged peaks of the asteroid, and sending a massive plume of pulverized rock and alien metal into the rings of Epsilon Eridani. Deep in the subterranean maintenance shaft, shielded by 300 feet of solid bedrock, reinforced blast doors, and a thermal dampening field, Corporal James Miller and Specialist Evelyn Cross were thrown violently against the wall. The ground shook with an intensity that rattled their teeth and bruised their ribs. The emergency lighting flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. They lay there in the dark, coated in dust, listening to the agonizing groans of shifting bedrock above them. Tommy, Cross, sobbed into the darkness, her hands covering her face. Miller put a heavy hand on her shoulder, his own tears cutting tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He knew what had happened. They both did. Sergeant Thomas Hendricks had bought their lives with the currency of his own, and he had made the Kalenons pay an exorbitant tax. Then there was only silence. The heavy, suffocating silence of a graveyard. It took 14 agonizing days for the Lockheed Boeing Emergency Response Flotilla to finally arrive in the Epsilon Eridani system. Captain Samuel Reed stood silently on the expansive observation deck of the heavy cruiser Archangel, staring intently at the main view screen. Where Outpost Delta Niner had once proudly stood, there was now only a smoldering, jagged crater 2 miles wide and half a mile deep. Embedded directly in the center of that massive devastation, permanently fused into the molten regolith like a broken and rusted spearhead, was the twisted, utterly unrecognizable metallic wreckage of the once invincible Kalenon Ascendancy Heavy War Dreadnought. "Captain," the Chief Sensory Operations Officer called out suddenly, his voice hushed with profound awe and confusion. "I am picking up a faint, repeating distress beacon. It is located deep underground, beneath the primary impact zone. It is a standard issue, encrypted Lockheed Boeing survival ping." Captain Reed narrowed his eyes, gripping the polished railing tightly. "Deploy the heavy excavation drones immediately," Reed commanded, his tone brokering absolutely no argument. "Get a fully armed Marine detachment down into that crater right now. We are absolutely not leaving this rock until we find out exactly what happened here and who is still breathing." It took another 48 hours of incredibly delicate laser drilling and heavy plasma cutting to finally breach the collapsed sub-basement of the ruined facility. When the heavy, warped blast doors were finally pried apart by massive mechanical jaws, the Federation Marines found them. Corporal James Miller and Specialist Evelyn Cross were severely dehydrated, suffering from acute malnutrition and battling severe oxygen deprivation, but they were remarkably alive. They were huddled together in the absolute darkness, wrapped in thermal blankets, rationing their final drops of recycled water. The Marines gently carried the 2 battered survivors out of the crushing, silent, cold subterranean tomb. But the Marines also found something else during their extensive excavation. Deep beneath the billions of tons of dreadnought wreckage, perfectly shielded inside the indestructible, shock-proof housing of the Chen Bauer Gravity Anchor's primary mainframe, they discovered the station's black box telemetry core. It had flawlessly recorded everything: security camera feeds, encrypted audio logs, environmental data fluctuations, and most importantly, the highly classified biometric telemetry continuously transmitted from Sergeant Thomas Hendricks's combat suit. The Lockheed Boeing technicians successfully extracted the intact data drive and brought it directly to Captain Reed. He spent the entire night reviewing the absolutely horrifying, raw, digital evidence. 3 months later, the Intergalactic Federation Council convened in an emergency session on Citadel Station, the massive, sprawling diplomatic hub located deep within the neutral zone of the Perseus Arm. The vast, cavernous chamber was a magnificent amphitheater constructed of polished obsidian and glowing hard light displays, packed tightly with the representatives of 300 allied and neutral species. The atmosphere inside the room was incredibly tense, thick with political animosity. The Kalenon Ascendancy, completely furious over the embarrassing loss of their advanced dreadnought and an esteemed fleet commander, was aggressively demanding immediate financial reparations and harsh military sanctions against humanity. The alien empire formally claimed that the Lockheed Boeing Exo Mining Corporation had employed an illegal, highly unsanctioned weapon of mass destruction to obliterate their noble vessel. Ambassador William Hayes, the chief human representative to the Federation, stood calmly at the central speaker podium. He was a tall, distinguished diplomat with silver hair and a face that usually carried an easy, welcoming smile. Today, however, his expression was carved from cold, unyielding granite. He looked out across the sea of alien faces, his posture rigid. He knew the data he was about to present would forever alter the entire galactic political landscape. The Kalenon Ascendancy claims that humanity used a catastrophic weapon of mass destruction, Hayes began loudly, his steady voice echoing through the advanced translation matrices of 300 different alien delegates. They claim we deliberately violated the sacred Geneva Accords of interstellar warfare. They are, in fact, half right. He reached down and deliberately tapped a complex sequence into his control podium. The bright, overhead lights in the massive council chamber instantly dimmed, plunging the audience into expectant shadows. The Kalenon delegates, seated prominently in their elevated, high-tier diplomatic box, leaned forward aggressively, their mandibles clicking in visible, angry irritation. "We did not use a nuclear bomb," Hayes stated clearly, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "We did not use a biological agent, nor did we deploy an orbital kinetic strike. We simply used a standard-issue Chen Bauer gravity anchor, and it was operated by a single, mortally wounded, dying man. A massive, high-resolution, holographic projection instantly materialized directly above the absolute center of the dark chamber. It displayed the highly detailed biometric and physiological data of Sergeant Thomas Hendricks. To the brilliant alien medical officers and scientists in the room, the flowing data made absolutely no sense. This is the precise telemetry of Sergeant Hendricks exactly at 0400 hours, Hayes continued methodically. A bright red marker suddenly appeared on a rotating digital wireframe of a standard human body. He suffered a direct, unprotected hit from a Kalanon heavy plasma rifle. The superheated bolt instantly destroyed 30% of his liver, completely severed his lower intestine, and caused massive, third-degree internal burns across his entire abdominal cavity. A loud, collective murmur of shock rippled rapidly through the crowded alien delegates. Several avian and reptilian species openly clicked their tongues or ruffled their scales in utter disbelief. According to the standard Federation medical databases, this is undeniably a fatal wound, Hayes explained calmly. It is classified as a Class 4 terminal trauma. The resulting neurogenic shock should have induced instantaneous, irreversible unconsciousness, quickly followed by total brain death within exactly 4 minutes. Commander Vral absolutely believed this biological fact. He arrogantly left Sergeant Hendricks to die alone on the floor, viewing him merely as broken, defeated prey. Hayes paused for a moment, letting the heavy reality of the alien commander's fatal miscalculation sink into the minds of the attentive council members. Then, he tapped the console firmly again. The massive holographic display shifted dynamically, now showing a detailed timeline of the chemical and hormonal levels violently fluctuating within Hendrix's brain and bloodstream. The digital graphs spiked violently, shooting completely off the standard measurement charts, glowing in an angry, pulsating crimson hue. This specific reaction is what Commander Vral absolutely did not understand about human biology, Hayes declared firmly. This is exactly what the wider galaxy currently does not understand about our species. Hayes leaned forward slightly, fiercely gripping the hard edges of the diplomatic podium. He stared directly up at the completely stunned Kalanon Ascendancy formal delegation representatives. Sergeant Hendricks did not experience standard neurogenic shock, Hayes proclaimed. His human brain quickly recognized that his physical survival was mathematically and biologically impossible. And so his nervous system completely abandoned the standard biological protocol for personal survival and immediately initiated the ancient evolutionary protocol for mutually assured destruction. The raw audio file from the dark coolant room suddenly played loudly. The heavy, ragged, wet breathing filled the room. And then came the horrific, guttural, agonizing roar as Specialist Cross brutally jammed the 2,000-degree emergency phosphorus flare directly into the open, bleeding plasma wound to stop the massive, fatal hemorrhaging. Several delegates visibly recoiled in sheer physical horror. The frail representative from the deeply pacifist Lumina species actually fainted in their chair, their natural bioluminescence flashing a terrified, blinding white. He forcefully cauterized his own fatal plasma wound with an emergency flare, Hayes stated coldly, letting the grim, terrifying implications hang heavy in the recycled air. His endocrine system instantly flooded his dying body with massive amounts of epinephrine and norepinephrine in toxic quantities that would be instantly, undeniably lethal to virtually any other advanced sentient species sitting inside this very room. He forcibly suppressed his agonizing pain receptors completely. He flooded his synapses with endorphins and forcefully commanded his dying, failing heart to beat at 180 times a minute just to remain conscious. Hayes continued relentlessly. He then played the raw security camera footage. The entire council watched in stunned, absolute, breathless silence as a dead man walking, a broken man bleeding out internally, his major organs systematically failing, dropped heavily from a high-ceiling pipe to brutally electrocute an elite, heavily armored Kalanon warrior. They watched him ruthlessly use a simple flashbang grenade and pressurized liquid helium to instantly shatter an entire Vanguard squad completely. They watched him expertly rig a massive industrial mining rock crusher to completely annihilate two full, heavily armed platoons of Kalanon shock troops. He actively fought for another 47 excruciating minutes, Hayes said, his powerful voice dropping to a harsh, intimidating whisper. He suffered catastrophic, irreversible tissue damage. He was actively suffocating in a depressurized environment. He was bleeding profusely. He was enduring an agony that literally cannot be accurately quantified by your most advanced medical scanners. But he absolutely did not stop fighting. Because your commander backed him into a corner and foolishly threatened the innocent people beneath him, finally, Hayes loudly played the preserved footage from the primary control room. The crisp audio of Hendricks and Vraal's final, fateful conversation played loudly in the completely silent, massive amphitheater. First rule of human warfare, Commander. You never corner something unless you're prepared to kill it instantly. Because when you back us into a corner, when you take away our future, our hope, our families, we stop caring about survival. Then, the brutal footage showed Hendricks forcefully pulling the heavy manual lever down. The massive gravity anchor activated, the screen violently shook, and the video feed instantly cut to static. The heavy silence hanging in the Federation Council chamber was incredibly deafening. The entire Kalanon delegation, seated high up in their luxurious tier box, was completely, totally paralyzed with shock. Their proud ambassadors' mandibles were trembling uncontrollably. The sheer, unadulterated psychological terror of what they had all just witnessed completely defied their entire ancient cultural understanding of honorable galactic warfare. The Kalanons proudly fought for glory. They bravely fought to conquer new worlds. But this broken human had ruthlessly fought and destroyed a dreadnought purely out of raw, unadulterated, vicious spite. They finally understood the true, terrifying danger of mankind. Humanity is a very young species in this grand federation, Hayes said calmly, firmly breaking the heavy, oppressive silence. We are absolutely not the strongest physically. We do not have thick, natural chitinous armor. Our kinetic weapons are relatively primitive compared to your advanced plasma and hardlight technology. You consider us soft, weak, and remarkably fragile. He slowly turned his head and looked directly, unblinkingly, at the terrified Kalanon delegation. But you must deeply understand our dark evolutionary history. We evolved on a violent death world. We spent millions of hard years as the hunted, highly vulnerable prey, constantly bleeding. The only way our species survived was by learning that if the wolf backs you against the wall, you do not beg for your life. You ruthlessly tear out the wolf's throat so that the rest of your pack can live, Hayes declared. Sergeant Hendricks was already dead, but he absolutely refused to die alone. The utter destruction of your billion-ton dreadnought is the steep price you paid for your fatal ignorance. But we are officially submitting a formal request to the Judicial Committee. A brand new galactic law must be written today, now. And that is just the beginning of why the galaxy fears a wounded human. The incident at Outpost Delta Niner changed intergalactic military doctrine forever, proving that a human with nothing to lose is the most dangerous weapon in the universe. If you want to hear the epic conclusion of Hendricks' final stand and the terrifying aftermath, smash that like button. Share this story with your fellow humans, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a sci-fi thrill. See you in the next one!
Hi, my name is Tran Trung, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, why the Intergalactic Federation has only one absolute rule: never ever corner a wounded human, HFY, sci-fi stories, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was the combination of desperation and determination throughout the story. A wounded human sounds vulnerable at first, but the more the situation escalated, the more you could feel how dangerous survival instincts can become when someone has nothing left to lose. That tension is one of the things I really enjoy about HFY stories. I also think the story quietly reminds us that resilience can appear in the hardest moments of life. Sometimes people discover their true strength only when they're pushed beyond their limits. In everyday life, that can mean refusing to give up even when situations feel impossible. Do you think the Federation truly learned its lesson after that encounter? And which moment in the story stayed with you the longest? Thanks for spending time with Palistrides today. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment and maybe like or subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories like this.